Solvi Lampthane of Yalmar Reach took the long ashwood lamp warden's pole from its iron rest beside the lamp house door at the cold hour before dusk. At the 47 cast-iron lamp-posts along the long road stood unlit against the snowfield, like a chain of small, still figures waiting. The pole was tall. The dark ash was worn smooth at the middle by 61 winters of 3 women's hands. The brass cup at the upper end was polished by use to a soft, warm gold. Solvi turned the pole in her hands once, slow, the way her mother had turned it before her, the way her grandmother had turned it before that. She set it back against her right shoulder. She lifted the small, dark iron storm lantern from its hook by the door. The lantern was the 8th in the family line. Its reservoir had been refilled at midday by Tovi. Mim, her small gray and white she-wolf, rose from the flagstone, walked across to Solvi's left heel, and waited. Old Mother Vigga Lampthane sat on the long stone bench along the inner wall. She had come down from the upper hold 3/4 of an hour before dusk, as she did every dusk. She had brought a small dark blue kerchief folded over her left forearm and set it on the shelf, and lifted from inside it a small soft square of pale linen with a fresh cotton wick wrapped at the center, and set the linen square on the bench beside the storm lantern. She had sat down. She had not spoken. Solvi knew the silence. Vigga only sat in the lamp house at dusk when she meant to stay. Tonight Vigga had brought the kerchief, and the storm was not yet on the road, and Solvi did not yet know what was being told. She did not ask. She turned to the small, low oak workbench. She drew the dark iron tinderbox from her hip. She struck. She lit the short, thick cotton wick of her storm lantern. She closed the iron storm hood over the glass. She set the brass cup end of the pole into the small, quiet flame through the open feed slot. The wick at the brass cup caught. She drew the pole out. The flame burned small and steady and tall. Tovi Grieveson stood at the door in his plain, undyed cream wool tunic, his soft gray wool cap pushed back on his shaggy, dark, coffee-brown hair. He had the oil pail across his right wrist on its hemp loop. He stepped back from the door. Solvi stepped past him. Mim followed at her left heel. The pole was on her right shoulder. The storm lantern was in her right hand. Tovi fell in 2 paces behind her with the pail. The cobblestone road ran southeast from the lower keep gate. The first lamp post was 20 paces from the lamp house door. The second was 80 paces beyond. The third was 80 paces beyond the second. The 47th was 4 miles beyond the lamp house at the foot of the Upper East Pass, where the cobblestone of the long road met the rough granite of the pass track and the road ended. Solvi had walked this road every dusk for 12 winters. She came to the first lamp post. She drew the pole from her shoulder. She lifted the brass cup end. She set the small, steady, tall flame at the brass cup against the wick of the first lamp post. The wick caught. The lamp came to a small, soft, pale amber light against the cold, gray-blue dusk. She did not look at the light. She turned, she walked, she lit the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, the eighth, the ninth, the 10th. By the 10th, the small chain of pale amber lights had begun to show against the cold blue snowfield, and Britta Road Watch at the 3rd milepost watch hut would already be at her low window. Solvi did not look back. She walked. At the 12th lamp, Mim at her left heel made a small, low sound. Almost not a sound. The sound of an old wolf marking a thing she has noticed. Solvi stopped. She turned her head a small fraction to the southeast. The wind was coming from the southeast. The Upper East Pass was southeast. Tonight it brought down something very faint, almost not there. A thin trace of horse-warm and cold steel, iron and leather and breath, a company of riders. Solvi drew a slow, careful breath. She turned back to the 12th lamp. She lit it. The 13th, the 14th. At the 15th, Toby behind her with the oil pail spoke for the first time. He said very quietly that the king's banner had been sighted on the upper east pass at second bell of the night. Solvi did not break her stride. She lit the 15th. She walked to the 16th. She lit it. She said only that she had heard. Toby did not say anything to that. He had been at the lamp house 6 winters, and he knew when she had heard a thing and did not want to discuss it. She lit the 17th through the 23rd. At the 24th, she had reached the 3rd milepost. The road watch hut sat 10 paces north of the road. The window was open. Britta Road Watch stood at it in her plain dark blue wool dress and her heavy soft black leather overjerkin, gray-streaked dark hair tied back under the soft white linen cloth, dark gray-blue eyes lifted to the chain of pale amber lights coming up the road to her. Britta lifted her right hand to the height of her shoulder, palm out, the small old sign that the chain of 23 lights from the lower keep gate had been counted and the road was held. Solvi lifted her right hand a hand's breadth from the storm lantern's carry ring, palm out, and lowered it again. Britta drew the small, dark wooden shutter closed. Solvi turned to the 24th lamppost. She lit it. The 25th, the 26th, the 27th. At the 28th, Toby behind her spoke again. He said very quietly that Master Eckerd had told the keep master at the high table at midday that the long road did not need to be walked tonight. He had said the king's company would come down by the lower curtain in the morning, and the chain of 47 lights was a waste of fish tallow at the start of winter. Solvi did not break her stride. She lit the 28th. She said low that she had been told this by the keep master at first light. She had told the keep master the road would be walked tonight. Toby said low that Viga had walked up to the upper hold and had spoken to the keep master herself at second bell of the day, and that the keep master had said no more after that. Solvi did not say anything. She lit the 29th through the 32nd. She thought of Viga in the lamp house behind her. Viga did not walk up to the upper hold any more if she could be carried. Viga had walked. She lit the 33rd through the 35th. At the 36th, the wind dropped a 1/4 degree, and the trace of horse-warm and cold steel came down on her clearer, and Mim at her left heel lifted her ears and held them lifted. Solvi turned her head a little southeast. The road ran on toward the foot of the upper pass, and the foot of the upper pass at this hour was a dark gray curtain of falling snow against a darker gray of crags above it. Somewhere in that curtain, a company of riders had begun the long descent. She walked. She lit the 37th through the 39th. At the 40th, Toby stopped and set the oil pail down. He looked back along the chain of 40 pale amber lights and lifted his hazel eyes to Solvi. He said that the chain against the cold blue dusk was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Solvi set her hand on his shoulder once, very small. She told him to wait for her at the 40th and not walk on toward the upper pass tonight. Toby nodded. She walked. She lit the 41st through the 46th. At the 47th, she stopped. The 47th stood where the cobblestone met the rough granite of the pass track. The wick was new. The glass was clean. Solvi set the small, steady, tall flame at the brass cup against the wick. The wick caught. The lamp came to pale amber against the cold, dark gray curtain of falling snow above the crags, and the chain of 47 was complete. Solvi lowered the pole. She drew a slow, careful breath. The wind brought the trace of horse-warm and cold steel down on her clear and steady. The company was nearer now. The first riders, if she squinted up the dark gray curtain, were perhaps a 1/4 hour away from the foot of the upper pass. She did not wait for them. She turned. She walked back along the road, Mim at her left heel, the pole on her right shoulder, the storm lantern in her right hand, the chain of 47 pale amber lights running clean and even and warm along the long road. She came to the 40th. Toby stood at the foot of the lamp where she had left him. The oil pail was at his feet. His hands were tucked under his arms against the cold. His hazel eyes were lifted along the road toward the foot of the upper pass. She did not look back. She set her hand on his shoulder again. She said low that the chain was lit and the road was held and they would go down to the lamp house. She said the king's company would come down in the next quarter hour. Toby nodded. He picked up the oil pail. He walked at her right side. They went down along the chain of pale amber lights. The wind moved the cold blue dusk into a deeper dark. The first stars came out above the long road. The keep above them lit its high hall windows. The road watch hut at the 3rd mile post showed a soft, warm light at its low window. They came back to the lamp house at the lower keep gate. Solvi stopped at the door. She turned back along the road and looked along the long chain of 47 pale amber lights running southeast. The chain was unbroken. The road was held. Somewhere far up at the foot of the upper pass, at the 47th lamp where the cobblestone met the rough granite, the first riders of the king's company had begun to come down. She could see, very small and very far, a small, slow movement of dark figures against the pale amber light. She lifted her right hand a hand's breadth from the storm lantern's carry ring. She set it palm out toward the foot of the upper pass. She lowered it. She did not know if the riders had seen. She turned. She went into the lamp house. Vigga sat on the long stone bench along the inner wall. The small dark blue kerchief was on the shelf. The small soft pale linen square was on the bench. Vigga had not moved. Solvi set the pole back in its iron rest beside the door. She set the storm lantern back on its hook. The small, steady flame burned on. She would let it burn through the night. The lantern at the door of the lamp house always burned through the night. It was the one light in the keep that did not go out. She took off her heavy, dark gray wool cloak. She hung it on the wooden peg by the door. She came to the long stone bench. She sat down beside Vigga. She did not say anything. Vigga did not say anything. Toby set the oil pail at the foot of the small, low oak workbench. He drew the tinder box from his pocket and laid it on the bench. He pulled his cap from his head, and he stood with his hands turned down at his sides and waited. Mim came to the foot of the long stone bench. She lay down at Solvi's left foot. The lamp house was quiet. Outside the door, the chain of 47 pale amber lights ran clean and even and warm along the long road from the lower keep gate to the foot of the upper east pass, and the king's company came down through the cold blue dusk along the chain, and the road was held. Vigga drew a slow, careful breath. She set her right hand on her ash walking stick. She lifted her left hand a hand's breadth from her lap, slow palm down, and set it against the small, dark iron lamp flame pendant at her own throat. She did not say anything. She lowered her hand. Solvi lifted her left hand a hand's breadth from her lap. She set it against the small dark iron lamp flame pendant at her own throat. She held it there a long, careful breath. She lowered her hand. The 2 old fingers and the young ones had touched the same iron at the same hour. Vigga rose at last. She drew her heavy charcoal wool shawl across her shoulders. She walked slow to the door and out into the cold blue dusk and up the slow path to the lower keep gate, one careful step at a time, the way she had walked it for 56 winters. The lamp house door fell shut. Solvi sat on the long stone bench beside the small, pale linen square Vigga had left for her, and she set her hands on her knees, and she waited for the king's company to come down to the lower keep gate. The king's company came down off the upper east pass at the foot of the 47th lamp at the quarter hour after full dusk. There were 9 riders, 4 men of his outer company, 4 of his inner, and the king at the center, with a great pale dark gray wolf at the king's right heel. The riders' cloaks were stiff with frozen snow. The king reined his horse at the foot of the upper east pass. The 47th burned at his left shoulder. The chain of pale amber lights ran clean southwest toward the lamp house. at the lower keep gate. The chain was unbroken. He sat his horse a long, careful breath. He had ridden the upper road for 12 winters and never come down by the long road. He had heard about the chain. His grandfather had spoken of it on the night before he died. 47 lamps lit for his company when the upper road had drifted shut at the high pass in his 51st winter. His grandfather had said the chain had not let his company walk off the cliff edge in the dark, and that it had been lit by a young woman walking alone with a small gray wolf at her heel. The king had been 7 winters old at his grandfather's bedside. He was 34 now. The chain below him at dusk was the same chain. He drew a slow, careful breath. His captain of the outer company, a tall, lean, weathered man of 52 with cropped gray hair, looked at him and waited. The king said in his quiet, deep voice, "The company will walk the road from the 3rd mile post. The horses will be led. The company will not pass the lamp warden. The lamp warden will be at the lower keep gate when we come down." The captain nodded. He turned his horse. He passed the order back along the line. The company dismounted at the foot of the 47th. The horse's breath clouded warm in the cold air. The king turned his horse over to his second outer rider, a young man of 26 with a soft red beard. He held his own reins. He walked his own horse southwest along the long road, with Rek at his right heel and the 8 riders walking their horses behind him in a loose, careful line. They walked. The chain of 47 pale amber lights ran clean ahead of them. The cold blue dusk had gone deeper. The first stars were out. The wind had dropped a 1/4 degree. They came down past the 46th and the 45th and the 44th. At the 43rd, the king saw a small figure standing alone at the foot of the 40th ahead, a thin boy in undyed cream wool with shaggy dark coffee brown hair under a soft gray cap, a small oil pail at his feet. The boy was watching the road southwest, watching the lamp warden go down without him. The king did not call. He walked. The company behind him walked. By the time they were 10 paces from the 40th, the boy had heard them. The boy turned. The hazel eyes went wide. The boy stepped back 2 paces from the lamppost. The king stopped his horse. He set the reins on his horse's neck. He did not move closer. He stood at his horse's shoulder, with his right hand on the horse's neck and his pale gray-blue eyes lifted at the level of the boy's hazel eyes. He said, in the quiet, deep voice that did not raise, that he was sorry to startle. The boy looked at the king's company. The boy looked at the great, pale, dark gray wolf at the king's right heel. The boy looked back at the king. The boy said, very low, that he was waiting for the lamp warden at the 40th. The king nodded once. He said, "The lamp warden has walked the chain. The chain is lit. The road is held. The boy has done well to wait at the 40th. The boy looked at him a long, careful breath. He picked up the oil pail. He stepped to the side of the road to let the company pass. The king did not pass. He turned to his captain. He said, "The company will walk the road from the 40th at the slow, careful pace of a small boy with an oil pail. No horse will pass the boy." The captain nodded. The king turned to the boy. He said, "Lo, you walk at the head." The boy did not move for a small, careful moment. Then the boy lifted the oil pail across his right wrist on its plain hemp loop, and he turned southwest along the long road, and he began to walk slow and careful past the 40th toward the 39th. The king walked his horse 2 paces behind the boy. The company walked behind the king. They came down past the 39th and the 38th and the 37th. At the 3rd mile post, the road watch hut sat 10 paces north of the road. The window was open. Britta Road Watch stood at it. She had been standing there since Solvi had passed at the 24th, since she had counted the chain of 47 complete and marked it in the small ledger. Now she lifted her right hand to the height of her shoulder, palm out toward the road, the same sign she had given Solvi. The king stopped his horse at the foot of the 34th. He turned his head north. He lifted his right hand from his horse's neck. Palm out. The same sign returned. Britta lowered her hand. She did not close the shutter. The king walked his horse past the 3rd milepost. He inclined his head once toward Britta. Britta inclined her head once toward the king. The king walked on. The company walked on. The boy at the head walked on. They came down past the 33rd and the 32nd and the 31st. The king walked at his slow, careful pace and watched the chain of pale amber lights run on southwest and felt the cold cobblestone steady under his boots and felt his grandfather's voice very quiet in his memory. His grandfather had said one thing about the chain. His grandfather had said her name had been Vigga. The king walked past the 20th. 43 winters had passed since his grandfather had walked this road, and the chain had not gone out. The boy at the head did not look back. He led the king's company past the 19th and the 18th, past the 10th and the 5th and the 3rd and the 2nd and the 1st. He led them past the lamp house at the lower keep gate. The lamp house door was closed. The lantern at the door burned soft and steady through the small, thick, clear glass against the cold blue night. The boy stopped at the lamp house door. He turned. He set the oil pail down on the small flagstone step. He drew off his soft gray wool cap and held it in his right hand. He looked at the king. The king reined a step short of the door. He did not dismount. He did not let any of his men dismount. The captain of his outer company, who had ridden up the line as they came past the 5th lamp, stopped his horse at the king's right shoulder. The king said low, "The company will go up to the lower keep gate. The keep master will have set the high hall. The chamberlain will receive them. The king will come up in the 2nd quarter of the hour." The captain nodded. He did not ask. He led the company up the slow path to the lower keep gate. The hooves rang slow on the cobblestone. The king sat his horse alone at the lamp house door. Vrek, at his right heel, sat down in the snow beside the wall. The king dismounted. He looped his reins over the iron lamp post by the door. He set his right hand on the lamp post. He drew a slow, careful breath. He turned to the boy. He asked, quiet, what the boy's name was. The boy lifted his hazel eyes. He said low that he was Tovi Grievson. The king nodded once. He said, Tovi Grievson has walked 9 horses southwest along the long road of Hjalmar Reach at the head of the king's company. The king will not forget the small, careful boy with the oil pail at the 40th. Tovi did not say anything. The hazel eyes went down to the flagstone. The king turned to the lamp house door. He did not knock. He set the back of his hand against the cold, dark oak of the door, slow, the way a man rests his hand on a thing he means to honor without owning. He stood that way for a long, careful breath. The door opened from the inside. Solvi Lampthane stood at the lamp house door. She had her heavy, dark gray wool cloak pulled across her shoulders. The dark iron lamp flame pendant at her throat was tucked under the wool of her dark blue dress. Her hands were turned palm down at her sides. Mim stood at her left heel, pale honey eyes lifted. The king did not step in. He drew his right hand back from the door. He set it palm out at the height of his own shoulder, the small old sign Britta had given him at the 3rd milepost. Solvi did not return the sign. She lifted her dark, warm brown eyes to the king's pale gray blue ones. She drew a slow, careful breath. She said low that her name was Solvi Lampthane of Hjalmar Reach. She said her grandmother had been Vigga Lampthane of Hjalmar Reach. She said her mother had been Sigrun Lampthane of Hjalmar Reach. She said the lamp house had been her grandmother's mother's before that. Back to the iron the lamp flame pendant had been hammered out of in a winter long before any of them. She said it not as a greeting. She said it the way a craftswoman names a bench when a man stands at the door of it. The king listened all the way through. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he drew a slow, careful breath. He said, in his quiet, deep voice, that his grandfather had been King Skarna, the far-sighted of the brim-walled throne. He said his grandfather had walked this long road at 51 winters old in the storm of the high pass 43 winters ago. He said his grandfather had been carried down on the chain of 47 by a young woman, walking alone with a small gray wolf at her heel. He said his grandfather had told him her name on the night his grandfather had died. He said the woman's name had been Vigga. He said this and stopped. Solvi did not say anything for a long, careful breath. She lifted her right hand a fraction. She set the back of her palm at the small, dark iron lamp flame pendant at her throat under the wool of her dress. She held it there. She lowered her hand. She said low that Vigga of Hjalmar Reach had been 17 winters old in the storm of the high pass 43 winters ago, and that Vigga had been her grandmother. She said Vigga sat at the lower keep gate now. She said Vigga had walked up to the upper hold today to speak to the keepmaster, because Master Eckard had said the chain ought not to be walked tonight. The king's pale gray-blue eyes went a small fraction harder at the name Master Eckard. He did not say the name. He said only, in the same quiet voice, that he was glad the chain had been walked. He said he would come back to the lamp house at first light. He did not say more. He did not promise. He did not push. He did not step into the lamp house. He turned. He drew his reins from the iron lamppost by the door. He set his pale gray-blue eyes once on Tovey at the flagstone. He set his right hand briefly on Rex's broad, pale, dark gray shoulder. He led his horse up the slow path to the lower keep gate. Solvi stood at the lamp house door and watched him go up the path. Mim at her left heel did not move. Tovey at the flagstone stood with his cap in his right hand. He drew a slow breath. He did not say anything. When the king was past the lower keep gate and out of sight, Solvi turned her dark, warm brown eyes down at last to Tovey. She said very low that he should come inside and warm his hands at the small iron brazier. She did not lift her own hand from her side as she said it. She did not let her hand shake. She closed the lamp house door. The chain of 47 pale amber lights ran clean into the cold blue night, and the storm lantern at the door burned soft and steady, and Solvi sat at the long stone bench with her hands flat on her knees and her eyes on the small iron brazier, and her grandmother had been 17 winters old, in a storm, 43 winters ago, and had walked the chain alone with a small gray wolf at her heel, and a king of 51 winters had come down it without dying, and Solvi had not known. The next day was a long gray day, with the cold sitting low on the road. Solvi went up to the lamp house an hour before the close of light. Vigga was already on the long stone bench with her kerchief on and the pale linen wick on her knee. The cane of black ash with the brass tip was leaned against the bench beside her, ready. Tovey came in with the oil pail. He counted the wicks. He counted the spare tinder irons. He sat on the stool beside the bench. He was ready. The keep was quiet. The smith's hammer had stopped at noon. The road watch hut had a single thin column of gray smoke going straight up. Solvi knew the king would come down at dusk. She had not been sent a runner. She knew because at his leaving, the morning before, he had said the words at dusk and gone up the lower stair without looking back. She made the brew of small bread and hot water. She gave the first cup to Vigga, the second to Tovey, the third to herself. They ate in silence. The light went down. The sky turned gray rose to gray rose purple. The wind dropped. Solvi took her pole from the peg. She slung the storm lantern at her hip. She set the flint and steel kit in her belt pouch. Tovey rose with her. He took the oil pail in his right hand and the bag of trim wicks in his left. He stood at her elbow. Vigga did not rise. She would walk down later, with her cane, and sit on the long stone bench at the lower keep gate and watch the chain from below, the way she had every dusk for 38 winters. Solvi opened the door. The king was at the foot of the south slope. He was alone. No banner, no company, no horse. Only his black wool cloak, the short, pale blonde beard, the silver streak at his right temple, the pale gray-blue eyes. He had walked the slope alone. Solvi came down the 4 flat slate steps with the boy behind her. The king came forward 3 paces. He stopped at the dark stone set in the gravel where the keep yard met the long road. The road stone, the marker between keep and road. He did not cross. He said, "May I walk the chain with you?" He did not say it as a king. He said it as a man who had asked the question of himself on the way down the slope. Solvi looked at him for the length of one slow breath. She looked at the boy. The boy was waiting. She said, "You may walk the chain with me, your grace, but the chain is the boy's work too, and the boy walks in front with the oil." "That is the order." The king said, "That is the order." He waited at the roadstone until she had crossed it with her pole. Then he stepped over after her. He fell in at her left shoulder. The boy went on ahead with the oil pail at the right. They walked west to the first lamp. The first lamp was the oldest of the 47, with a small notch in the iron base from the cart that had hit it 41 years ago. She tipped the brass measure into the reservoir. She trimmed the wick. She set it at the height she always set it. She struck flint to steel. The pale amber light came on inside the heavy storm glass. The king was not looking at her. He was looking at the flame, the way a man looks at a thing he has not seen since he was a child. He said nothing. He stepped back. The boy stepped forward with the oil pail. They moved on to the second lamp. She lit the second the same way. She lit the third. The king did not speak. The wind did not rise. At the 6th lamp, the king said, "What was the height?" She said, half the width of my smallest finger above the brass burner. That is the height my mother set when she gave me the pole, and my grandmother set when she gave my mother the pole. And that is the height the lamp was made for when it was cast at Strand on the Reach in the second winter of King Skarna the Far-sighted, your grace. At the 12th, he said, "What is the count?" She said, 47, your grace. We are at 12. He said, "I have lost the count. I will keep it from the next one." He kept the count. He counted 13 and 14 and 15 under his breath. At the 18th, Solvi stopped. She turned to the boy. She said, "Tovi, the rhythm, now." 2 paces of rest at the 18th and 2 at the 33rd. That is the order. Take it. The boy lowered the oil pail and took the 2 paces of rest. The king laid his black wool cloak across the boy's shoulders. The cloak was lined with the soft, pale gray underfur of the cold circuit pelt. It went past the boy's knees. The king said, "The boy has the order of the bench. I will keep the count." The boy lifted the oil pail again. He nodded the way Vigga had taught him to nod when work was given. They went on. She lit the 18th and the 19th and the 20th. The king kept the count. The boy kept the rhythm. They came to the 3rd milepost at the 25th lamp. The window of the road watch hut was open. Britta stood at it with her 2 men behind her shoulder. She had her right hand at her chest, palm out, fingers loose, the same sign she had given the morning before. The king saw her. He lifted his right hand and gave the same sign back, palm out, fingers loose, the sign of safe travelers seen. Britta's eyes moved to Solvi. She gave the small nod that meant the road is well kept this hour. Solvi gave the small nod that meant the chain is on time. The king watched the 2 nods. He said, "How long has the road watch given that sign?" Britta said, "The sign was given to my mother by her mother, and to her mother by her mother. It is the chief sign of the 3rd milepost. It was given first in the 2nd winter of King Skarna, the Far-sighted, your grace, and the chief of the road watch hut has given it every dusk since." The king said, "I did not know." Britta said, "No, your grace. The men of the upper hall have not asked." The king said, "Thank you, chief." Britta closed the window. They went on. They lit the 26th and the 27th. The king kept the count. The boy kept the rhythm. The cloak was still on the boy. The boy had stopped shivering. At the 33rd, the boy took his 2 paces of rest. The king set his hand on the boy's shoulder. The hand was light. The boy did not look up. They lit on. The light of the chain ran ahead of them now and behind them now, and the road was a narrow cord of pale amber lamps in the gray rose-purple cold. At the 40th, Solvi turned to the boy. She said, "Tovi, you go down now. You take the cloak to my grandmother at the lamp house. You tell her the chain is at the 40th. You give her the cloak and you sit with her until I come." The boy looked up. The boy looked at the king. The king said nothing. The boy said the order, Lampthane. She said the order is the boy goes back at the 40th. On the Dusk, the king walks the chain. That is a new order. I am setting it. Vigga will keep it. The boy nodded. He laid the cloak carefully across the king's left forearm. He turned and walked back east along the chain with the oil pail at his right and the bag of wicks at his left, and he did not look back because that was the way Vigga had taught him. The king fastened the cloak at the throat. He took up his place at her left shoulder. They lit the 41st through the 46th. They came up to the foot of the Upper East Pass at the 47th. The wind off the pass was sharper here. She lit the 47th. The pale amber light came on. The chain was complete. 47 lamps, 4 miles, 1 unbroken chain. She stepped back. The king did not step back. The king stayed at the foot of the 47th lamp with his right hand on the iron post. His pale gray-blue eyes were on the small flame. The silver streak at his right temple caught the flame's light. He said, "My grandfather came down this lamp at the 7th hour of his 51st winter. He came down at this lamp. The 40th was where she met him. The 47th was where he stopped. The 47th is where he was given the pole. He looked at her then. He looked her square in the face. He said, 'Your grandmother was 17. She said, 'Yes, your grace.' He said, 'Your mother was your age.' She said, 'My mother was 26 when she lit the 47th alone the first winter. She was 26, the Dusk King Hagen the Younger came down. He did not stop. He did not see her. He said no. She said, "No, your grace." He said, "I was at his right shoulder that dusk. I was 9 winters. I did not see her either." She said, "No, your grace. The men of the upper hall do not see the bench." He did not answer. He stood at the foot of the 47th lamp with his hand on the iron post for the length of 7 slow breaths. The pale amber flame was on his face. The wind off the pass moved the small, pale blonde hairs of his beard. Then he turned. He came down off the foot of the upper east pass. He took up his place at her left shoulder. They walked back east along the chain. He kept the count. He counted 46 and 45 and 44. He counted back the way the boy had been taught to keep it back. He did not stop until they came to the 3rd milepost. At the 3rd milepost, the road watch hut window was closed. The hut was at the rest hour. The king stopped. He turned his face north toward the closed window. He gave the sign. Palm out. Fingers loose. The window did not open. He did not expect it to open. The sign was given because the sign was the order, not the conversation. He turned back to her. He said, "Lampthane." She said, "Your grace." He said, "What is the count tonight?" She said, "The count tonight is 47, your grace." And one boy who took the cloak back to the lamp house at the 40th, which is a new order set tonight by the Lampthane and to be kept by the bench. The count is the same as it has been every dusk of the 61 winters my line has held the chain. 47. He said the count of the chain is 47. The count of the women who hold the chain in this hold is 3. Vigga at the bench, Sigrun in the ground, you at the pole. She did not answer. She did not look down. She held his eye. He said, "I will come down again tomorrow at dusk." She said, "The chain will be ready for the king at dusk." He said, "The chain has always been ready. The king has been late." He bowed once, the small bow of the cold circuit, the bow of one company captain to another. He did not bow as a king. He turned. He went south up the slope to the keep. She stood at the 3rd milepost with the chain of 47 lights running east to her hand and west to her hand. She did not move for the length of 4 slow breaths. Then she went down to the lamp house. The boy was on the small 3-legged stool beside Vigga. Vigga had her cane on her knee and her pale gray eyes on the door. Vigga said, "The king walked the chain." Solvi said, "The king walked the chain." Vigga said, "The king kept the count." Solvi said, "The king kept the count." Vigga said, "The king will come down again at dusk." Solvi said, "The king will come down again at dusk." Vigga closed her eyes for the length of 2 slow breaths. She opened them. The boy was tired. Vigga said, "The boy will sleep in the loft tonight, Lampthane." Solvi said, "The boy will sleep in the loft tonight, grandmother." The boy was already half asleep. Solvi lifted him. He was lighter than the oil pail, and carried him up the loft ladder. She laid him on the small straw cot. She drew the brown wool blanket over him. She came back down. She sat on the long stone bench beside Vigga. The chain of 47 lights burned along the 4 miles of the long road, and there was no traveler on the road tonight, and yet the king had come down twice in 2 days, and the chain had held, and a new order had been set at the 40th. Vigga said, "Sleep, child." Solvi said, "Yes, grandmother." She did not sleep. The king's bow at the 3rd milepost stayed in her chest the way a small clean bone stays under the skin of the wrist after a fall, and she sat with it in the cold, and she held the pole across her knees, and she waited for first light. First light came gray and slow. Solvi rose from the bench. Vigga had been there all night. The boy was still in the loft. She took her pole and her storm lantern. She kissed Vigga on the kerchief at her right temple. She went out into the gray cold to quench the chain west to east. She was at the foot of the 44th when she saw the figure at the 3rd milepost, a man on the gravel in a fur-lined cloak. He wore the polished dark bronze pin. He was Master Eckhard Lampthane, 41 winters, her uncle. He had come down for her. She kept walking. She quenched the 44th and the 43rd and the 42nd. The work was the work. The work did not change because Master Eckhard Lampthane had come down at first light. He walked west to meet her at the 25th. He stopped 4 paces from her. He looked at the small, dark iron pin at her throat, the pin of the working lamp warden, plain, the pin her mother had given her at 12 winters. He said, "The chain was walked yesterday by the king." She said, "The chain was walked yesterday by the king and the Lampthane and the apprentice." The order was the same as every dusk of the 12 winters. He said, "The chain is the master's chain." She said, "The chain is the master's chain when the master walks it. The master has not walked the chain in 9 winters. He said, "The master walks the chain when the king is on the road." She said the master did not walk the chain when the king came down at the foot of the 47th the morning before, and the master did not walk the chain at dusk yesterday. And the master is not walking the chain now at first light. His face did not move. He had a long, fair, pale face with a heavy ash-blonde beard. He had pale gray eyes, the same as Vigga's, only colder. He was Vigga's brother's son. He had taken the pin at 32 when his father died. He had not stood at the bench since. He said, the master's pin will be at the chain at dusk tonight. The master will walk the chain at dusk tonight. The Lampthane will hold the oil pail. She did not answer. She held the pole. The brass cup was at the height of her hip. The pole was very steady in her hand. He said, the parchment is mine to write. The parchment names the master, and the master names the lamp warden. The pin is at my throat. She said, the parchment is yours to write, master, but the chain is mine to walk. He said, not at dusk tonight. He turned. He walked east on the long road. The polished, dark bronze pin caught the gray first light. He went up the lower stair to the upper hall. Solvi quenched all the way down to the first. The work was the work. She did not hurry. When she came back to the lamp house, she did not tell Vigga. She did not have to. Vigga had heard the boots on the gravel. Vigga said, the master. Solvi said, the master. Vigga said, the parchment. Solvi said, the parchment. Vigga said, dusk. Solvi said, dusk. Vigga said, the king. Solvi said, the king will come down at dusk. Vigga closed her eyes. The boy came down the loft ladder. He had slept in the cloak the king had laid on him at the 18th lamp the night before. He held the cloak out to Solvi. He said, the king's cloak, Lampthane. She said, the boy will give the cloak back to the king at dusk tonight. The boy nodded. He set the cloak across the bench beside Vigga. Vigga laid her hand on it. The cloak was black wool, lined with the soft, pale gray underfur of the cold circuit pelt. Vigga's old hand on the dark wool was very thin. The day went the way every day went. The boy went down to the cooper's shed for the noon bread. Solvi did the small day tasks. At the third hour after noon, the runner came down from the upper hall. He held a small, folded parchment. He said, Lampthane from the master. Solvi did not take the parchment. She said, read it. The runner unfolded the parchment with a thin, shaking voice. The parchment said, by the order of Master Eckard Lampthane, lamp master of the chain, signed in the 11th winter of his pin, the chain at dusk this day shall be walked by the master alone, and the Lampthane Solvi shall hold the bench, and the apprentice Tovi shall hold the oil pail at the master's right. Solvi did not answer. The runner laid the folded parchment on the bench beside Vigga. Vigga laid her hand on it the way she had laid her hand on the king's cloak. The runner went back up the slope. The afternoon went down. The cold went deeper. The gray rose came up over the Upper East Pass. The boy came in. He had the oil pail. His hazel eyes went to the cloak on the bench. His eyes went to the parchment on the cloak. His eyes went to Vigga's hand on the parchment. The boy said nothing. The boy waited. The light went down. The master came down the slope at the close of light. He had on the heavy, fur-lined cloak. He had the polished, dark bronze pin at his throat. He had no pole. He had not held a pole in 9 winters, and the pole he had once held had been cut down for kindling at the spring fair 4 winters ago. He stopped at the threshold of the lamp house. He did not cross. He said, the parchment. Vigga lifted her hand. She held the parchment out. The master took it. He said, the Lampthane will hold the bench. The apprentice will hold the oil pail. The master will walk the chain. Vigga did not answer. Vigga's pale gray eyes were on the master's pale gray eyes. The 2 pairs of eyes were very still. The boy stood up. The boy lifted the oil pail. The boy went to the threshold beside the master. The boy looked at Solvi. Solvi said, Tovi, the order is the master's tonight. Walk where he tells you. Set the oil where he tells you. Do not set the wick. The master will set the wick. The master said, the apprentice will set the wick. Solvi said, the apprentice will not set the wick. The apprentice has 11 winters. The wick will be set by the man with the pin or the woman with the pole. The apprentice will hold the oil pail. The master's mouth moved a small way. He did not answer. He turned. He came down the slate steps. He stepped over the dark stone in the gravel. He turned west on the long road. The boy followed with the oil pail. They came to the first lamp. The master tipped the small brass measure into the reservoir. He took up his small iron trim blade. He fumbled with it. The trim blade had not been in his hand in 9 winters. He cut the wick wrong. He cut it short, below the height of the brass burner. He set flint to steel. The flint slipped. The flint slipped again. The boy watched. The boy did not say anything. The master got the wick lit. The flame came up small and weak. It would not last the night. The king came down the south slope. He was alone again. He had only his black wool cloak, the second cloak, with the silver clasp at the throat. He stepped over the dark stone in the gravel and stopped at the first lamp. The master saw him. The master straightened. The master had the parchment in his right hand. The master bowed. The master said, "Your grace." The king said, "Master." The master said, "The chain at dusk is the master's tonight. The Lampthane is at the bench. The apprentice is at the oil pail." The king said, "The chain at dusk yesterday was walked by the Lampthane and the apprentice and the king." The master said, "Yes, your grace." The king said, "The wick at the first lamp is below the height of the brass burner." The master said, "The wick will be trimmed at the next dusk, your grace." The king said, "The flame at the first lamp will go out at the third hour of the dark." The master did not answer. The king said, "Master, give me the parchment." The master held the parchment out. The king took it in his left hand. He did not unfold it. He did not read it. He tore it once and again and again. He let the small pieces fall on the gravel of the long road at the foot of the first lamp. The master watched the parchment fall. The king said, "Master, go up to the upper hall, bring down the master's pin, lay it on the long stone bench beside Vigga Lampthane, then go back up to the master's room under the king's elk skull, and do not come down to the road again until the master's pin is given to you again, or to another, by the king, in the keep yard, at first light, in front of the Lampthane and the bench." The master did not move. The king said, "Master." The master moved. The master walked east on the long road. He did not look at the boy. He did not look at the king. He went up the slope to the upper hall. The king turned to the boy. He said, "Apprentice?" The boy said, "Your grace." The king said, "Take the oil pail to the lamp house. Tell the Lampthane the chain is at the first lamp, and the king is at the first lamp, and the chain is hers to walk." The boy went very fast. The oil pail bumped against his knee. He did not spill. He came up the slate steps. He said, "Lampthane, pole, first lamp, king." Solvi rose. She took the pole from the peg. She slung the storm lantern. She set the flint and steel in her belt pouch. She came down the slate steps with the boy at her side. The king was at the first lamp. The small pieces of torn parchment were at his feet on the gravel. She came up to the first lamp. She did not look at the parchment. She looked at the wick. The wick was below the height of the brass burner. She lifted her trim blade. She trimmed the wick again. She set the wick at her height, half the width of her smallest finger above the brass burner. She struck flint to steel. The wick took. The pale amber light came up clean and steady inside the heavy storm glass. The flame at the first lamp now would last the night. The king said, "Lampthane." She said, "Your grace." He said, "The chain is yours." She said, "The chain is mine." He said, "Walk it." She walked it. She lit the second and the third and the fourth. The boy walked at her right with the oil pail. The king walked at her left. The chain went on. The gray rose purple went deep over the upper east pass. At the 18th, the king laid his second cloak across the boy's shoulders, the way he had laid the first cloak on the boy the night before. The boy nodded the way Vigga had taught him. At the 40th, the boy went down with the cloak to Vigga at the lamp house. The order had been kept. She lit the 47th at the foot of the upper east pass. The chain was complete. 47 lamps, 4 miles, 1 unbroken chain. She stepped back. The king said, "Lampthane." She said, "Your grace." He said, "The master will not walk the chain again." She said, "No, your grace." He said, "The pin will be given again at first light." She said, "The pin will be given." He said, "By whose hand?" She said, "By the king's hand." He said, "To whose throat?" She did not answer. She held the pole. The chain ran east from her hand, 47 lights along the 4 miles, all the way down to the first lamp at the keep gate, where Vigga sat now on the long stone bench at the lower keep gate with her cane and her kerchief and the king's torn parchment in a folded square on her lap. The king said, "The answer is at first light." She said, "The answer is at first light, your grace." He bowed once, the cold circuit bow. He turned. He went east along the chain. He did not stop at the 3rd mile post. The road watch hut window was open. Britta gave the small nod the chief gives to a captain who has finished the patrol. The king gave it back. He went up the slope to the keep. Solvi went down to the lamp house. The boy was on the small 3-legged stool. Vigga was on the long stone bench with the king's torn parchment on her lap. Vigga said, "The master will not walk the chain again." Solvi said, "No, grandmother." Vigga said, "The pin at first light." Solvi said, "The pin at first light." Vigga said, "Sleep, child." Solvi said, "Yes, grandmother." She did not sleep. She sat on the bench beside Vigga, the boy asleep on the stool against Vigga's wool sleeve, and the chain burned on the cold gravel, and the king's words, "By whose hand, to whose throat," sat in her chest, and she held the pole across her knees, and she waited for first light. First light came gray and slow. Solvi did the work of quenching west to east, alone. The cold was deeper. The cold circuit men at the lower keep gate had said the storm was coming up out of the western fjord on the second tide. When she came back from the chain, there was a man at the roadstone. The man was the king. He had the polished, dark bronze pin in his open right palm, the master's pin, laid on the long stone bench beside Vigga at the second hour of the dark by the hand of the kitchen runner. The king said, "Lampthane." She said, "Your grace." He held out the polished, dark bronze pin. He said, "The bench. The bench will say the throat." He laid the pin on her open right palm. He did not close her hand around it. He let her decide. She closed her hand on the pin. The pin was cold from the keep yard. The pin was the size of her thumbnail. It was a small thing in her hand. She turned. She walked up the slate steps. Vigga was on the long stone bench with her kerchief on. The boy was beside her on the stool. Britta had come down from the road watch hut at first light and stood inside the door at Vigga's right shoulder. The four, Vigga, Solvi, Britta, and the boy, were the bench. Solvi laid the pin on the bench beside Vigga. She said, "The master's pin is on the bench. The bench will say the throat." Vigga laid her thin old hand on the pin. Her pale gray eyes were on Solvi's face. Her mouth did not move for the length of 3 slow breaths. Then Vigga said, "The throat is the Lampthane's. The pin will be set at the Lampthane's throat at the close of the road feast at the foot of the 47th, where the king's grandfather was given the pole, where my hand gave him the pole, where my hand will give the Lampthane's hand the pin." Britta said, "The bench has spoken." Solvi went down to the king at the roadstone. She had the pin in her closed right hand. She said, "The bench has said, the throat." The king said, "The throat is the Lampthane's." She said, "The throat is the Lampthane's." He said, "The road feast." She said, "The close of the road feast at the foot of the 47th by my grandmother's hand on the gravel of the long road, before the king and the bench and the chain." The king bowed. He said, "The road feast at the close of light tomorrow. The chain will be the chain. The bench will be the bench. The king will come down with no banner and no company." She said, "Yes, your grace." He said, "The storm is coming up out of the western fjord on the second tide. The cold circuit captain has read the air. The storm will close the road from the upper east past to the 3rd milepost in the 3rd hour of the dark. Any traveler still on the upper road then will not come down without the chain." She said, "The chain will be lit early. The chain will be lit at the close of light. The chain will be doubled at the wick height by half a finger to keep against the wind. The boy will sleep at the lamp house tonight. I will hold the storm lantern at the foot of the 47th. The king said, "I will hold the road watch hut with Britta and her 2 men at the 3rd milepost." She said, "Yes, your grace." He went up the slope to the keep. The day went the way the long days went before a storm. Britta's 2 men brought down the heavy oil jar. Tovi went up and down twice with the oil pail. Solvi cut wicks at half a finger above the brass for all 47 lamps. The polished, dark bronze pin lay on the bench at Vigga's right hip, on a folded square of pale linen. The light went down early. The gray rose came up over the upper east pass, and then the gray rose purple, and then the dark gray of the storm. The wind began to rise. The cold went deep into the gravel. Solvi took her pole. The boy took the oil pail. They went out. The king came down. He gave the boy his cloak again at the 18th. The second cloak, the one the boy had not given back. They lit the chain. The wind rose. By the 33rd, the wind was sharp. By the 40th, the wind was hard. The boy went down to Vigga at the 40th with the cloak. Solvi and the king walked on, and Solvi lit the 41st and the 42nd and the 43rd. The wind came off the upper east pass in long, hard gusts. The pale amber lights bent in their storm glass. They did not go out. The half-finger height held. She lit the 47th at the foot of the upper east pass. She did not step back. She set the storm lantern at the foot of the post. She tightened the small brass band at the lantern's hood. She set the wick of the storm lantern at the same half-finger height. She knelt on one knee on the gravel beside the post. The king said, "Lampthane." She said, "Your grace." He said, "The 3rd milepost." She said, "The foot of the 47th. I will hold here." He said, "The bench is at the lamp house. The road watch is at the 3rd milepost. The Lampthane is at the foot of the upper east pass. The chain is the chain." He turned. He walked east along the chain. The wind hit his cloak. The silver streak at his right temple caught the pale amber of the 46th as he passed under it. He did not stop. He went down to the 3rd milepost. She knelt at the foot of the 47th. The first hour of the dark went. The chain held. The wind rose. The storm came down off the pass. The 2nd hour of the dark went. The chain held. The pale amber lights bent and did not go out. In the 3rd hour of the dark, she heard them on the upper road. It was a man's voice first, a thin, tired voice calling down out of the wind. It was not the cold circuit voice. It was a road voice, a traveler. The man came into the pale amber of the 47th. He was a small, thin man in a wet wool cloak with a short brown beard and ice in the beard. He had a woman with him. The woman was younger. The woman had on a heavy travel cloak and a wool kerchief. The woman was carrying a bundle. The bundle was a child. The child was very small. The child was wrapped in a brown wool blanket. The child's face was gray-white and very still. The child was breathing fast and shallow. The child had the lung fever. The child was 4 winters, and the child would not come down off the upper east pass alive without warmth. Solvi rose from her knee. She took the storm lantern off the post. She held it up. The pale amber light fell on the woman's face. The woman was crying without sound. Solvi, road, Lampthane, chain to the keep. Take the chain, 46 lamps east. Road watch at the 3rd milepost has fire and broth. Lamp house at the keep gate has the bench and the hearth. The bench will take the child. She took the man's right arm through her left. She held the storm lantern in her right. She went east along the chain. The woman walked behind with the child against her chest. The pale amber lights ran ahead of them in the hard wind. At the 3rd milepost, the road watch hut window was open. Britta was at the window. The king was at the door. The king saw the storm lantern come down out of the wind. The king saw the woman with the bundle. The king came out into the gravel. He said, child. Solvi said, lung fever, 4 winters, lamp house, bench, hearth, broth. The king lifted the bundle from the woman's arms. The woman did not let go at first. The woman let go when she saw the silver streak and the pale gray-blue eyes, and the hand that took the bundle was the hand of a man who had carried small children before. The king walked east. He held the bundle against the warmth of his cloak. The chain ran ahead. 25, 24, 23. The pale amber lights bent in the wind. They did not go out. Solvi held the man up. Britta came out of the hut and held the woman by the right elbow. The woman could not walk on her own. Britta held her. The 4 of them, Solvi, the man, Britta, the woman, came down the chain behind the king. At the first lamp, Vigga was at the lamp house door with the cloak and the boy and the broth. Vigga had the cloak open. Vigga laid the cloak over the king's shoulders and over the bundle. Vigga took the bundle from the king's arms onto her own bench. The boy lifted the small bowl of broth. Vigga laid her thin old hand on the child's gray-white forehead. Vigga said, the child will live. The child did not move. The child was breathing. The breathing was fast and shallow. Vigga took the small linen cloth from her kerchief and dipped it in the broth and laid it on the child's lips. The child swallowed. The child did not open the eyes. The child swallowed. Vigga laid the cloth on the lips a second time. The child swallowed. The breathing slowed. The mother sank to her knees on the floor of the lamp house beside the bench. She put her face in her hands and she did not make a sound. The father stood at the door. The king laid his cloak across the father's shoulders. In the 5th hour of the dark, the child opened the eyes. The eyes were dark gray-blue. The child looked at Vigga. The child closed the eyes. The breathing was slow and even. The child slept the sleep that was not the sleep of the dying. Vigga said, the child will live. The mother put her hands down. The mother's eyes were on Vigga. The mother's eyes were on Solvi at the door with the storm lantern. The mother's eyes were on the lamp flame pendant of dark iron at Solvi's throat. The mother said, Lampthane. What is your name? Solvi said, Solvi Lampthane. The mother said, the chain is named for you. Solvi said, the chain is older than my name. The mother said, the chain that came up out of the dark and walked us 4 miles down off the upper east pass in the 3rd hour of the storm is named for you tonight. The child will be named for the chain. The child will be named for the woman who held the storm lantern at the foot of the 47th. The father said, Solvi. The mother said, Solvi. The child slept. The mother knelt on the floor of the lamp house. The father stood at the door under the king's cloak. The king stood at the door without a cloak. The wind was outside. The chain was outside. The bench was inside. The boy laid a second small bowl of broth at the king's feet. The king sat down on the floor of the lamp house with his back against the wall, and he ate the broth with the small wooden spoon that the boy gave him, and he did not speak. The storm went on outside. The chain held. In the 7th hour of the dark, the storm broke. The wind dropped. The cold went thinner. The pale amber lights of the 47 were still burning down the 4 miles of the long road. In the 8th hour of the dark, first light came up gray and slow over the upper East Pass. The chain had held. The bench had held. The road watch had held. Solvi went out into the gray first light to quench the chain west to east. She did the work alone. The wind was gone. The cold was the cold of every first light. The work was the work. When she came back to the lamp house, the king was asleep on the floor with his back against the wall. The mother was asleep on the bench against Vigga's wool sleeve. The father was asleep on the small 3-legged stool. The child was asleep in Vigga's lap. The boy was asleep on the floor at the king's feet. Vigga was awake. Vigga was always awake at first light. Vigga said, "The chain held." Solvi said, "The chain held." Vigga said, "The bench held." Solvi said, "The bench held." Vigga said, "The road feast." Solvi said, "The road feast at the close of light." Vigga laid her old hand on the polished, dark bronze pin on the folded pale linen square. The pin was still on the long stone bench. The pin had not moved. Vigga said, "The throat at the close of light, child." Solvi said, "The throat at the close of light, grandmother." She sat down beside the sleeping ones with the pole across her knees, and the day came up clean, and the storm was gone, and the chain had held, and the name of the child, sleeping in Vigga's lap, was Solvi. The day was the day of a road feast. Word ran down out of the upper hall by the kitchen runner at the 2nd hour. The keep had not had a road feast in 11 winters. The last had been the year King Hagen the Younger died, and Ivan had taken the Brimwald throne. The smith's hammer started at the 3rd hour. The cooper gave out the small barrel staves for the trestle tables. The breadwomen began the long loaves. The 3 goats were brought up for the spit. The cold circuit men rolled up their sleeves and did the work of the spit fire and the trestle frame. The king did the work with them. He had on the dark gray wool every man in the cold circuit wore. He had no cloak. He had no pin at his throat. He had the silver streak at his right temple and the pale gray-blue eyes, and his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his hands at the trestle frame. Britta rode watch, and her 2 men came down at the 5th hour. Britta went to the bench at the lamp house. The mother and the father and the child were still there. The child was awake, sitting up in Vigga's lap, eating a small piece of long loaf. The 4 of them had been on the bench since first light. Britta came in. She laid her right hand at her chest, palm out, fingers loose, the sign of safe travelers seen. The mother saw the sign. The mother gave the sign back, palm out, fingers loose. The mother had been taught the sign at the 2nd hour after first light by the boy. The boy had been taught the sign at 3 winters by Vigga. Britta said the road watch knows the bench. Vigga said the bench knows the road watch. Britta sat down on the long stone bench beside Vigga, and she took the pale linen wick from her own kerchief and she laid it on her knee. The road watch wick was the same wick as the bench wick. They had been the same wick since the 2nd winter of King Skarn the Far-Sighted. The light of the day was clean. The cold was less. The wind was gone. The smell of the spitfire and the long loaves came up out of the keep yard. At the 7th hour, Solvi went out to the chain. She went west to east. She tipped the small brass measure into each of the 47 reservoirs. She set each wick at the half-finger height. She did not strike flint. The chain would be lit at the close of light by the Lampthane and the apprentice. She came down to the lamp house. The boy was at the door in a clean brown wool tunic. The mended tear at the shoulder had been mended a 2nd time. The boy had on his small wool cap with the hair fur ear flaps. The boy held the oil pail and the bag of trim wicks. The boy was very serious. Solvi took her pole. She set the small flint and steel kit in her belt pouch. She slung the storm lantern at her hip. She lifted the small loop of brass rod for spare wicks over her shoulder. The dark iron lamp flame pin was at her throat. The polished, dark bronze pin was on the bench beside Vigga, on the folded square of pale linen. Vigga rose. She had not risen from the bench in 9 winters, except to walk down to the lower keep gate at dusk. She took up her cane of black ash with the brass tip. She laid her old, thin left hand on Solvi's right shoulder. Vigga said, "Lampthane," Solvi said. "Grandmother." Vigga said, "The throat at the close of light." Solvi said, "Yes, grandmother." The 4 of them, Vigga, Solvi, the boy, Britta, came out of the lamp house. The mother and the father and the child came after them. The mother had the child in her arms. The child was watching the spitfire. The keep yard was full. The trestle tables were set in the long line from the lower keep gate to the road stone. The smith and the cooper and the breadwomen and the cold circuit men stood at the tables. The stew kettles were on the spitfire. The long loaves were on the boards. The king came out from among the cold circuit men at the trestle frame. He had put his black wool cloak on again, with the silver clasp at the throat. The silver streak at his right temple was bright in the gray rose. He came up to the roadstone. He stopped. He did not cross. The keep yard fell quiet. The king said, "Hold of Hjalmar Reach." The keep yard held still. The king said, "The chain of the long road has been walked in this hold for 61 winters by the line of 3 women, Vigga Lampthane, Sigrun Lampthane in the ground, and Solvi Lampthane at the pole. The chain has been walked alone for 38 of those winters by Vigga before the line passed to her daughter. The chain has been walked alone for 12 of those winters by Solvi since her mother died. The chain held last night through the first storm of the long winter and brought 4 travelers down off the upper east pass in the 3rd hour of the dark. A man, a woman, and a child of 4 winters with the lung fever, who is sitting now in Vigga Lampthane's arms in this yard and is named Solvi. The keep yard did not move. The king said, "The chief of the road watch hut at the 3rd mile post is Britta Road Watch, and the sign of safe travelers seen has been given by the chief of the 3rd mile post since the 2nd winter of King Scarn the Far-Sighted, and the sign was given to me at the 25th lamp, the dusk before last, by Britta Road Watch. And the sign was given to her by her mother, and to her mother by her mother, and the chain has not been broken." The king said, "The apprentice of the bench is Tovi Grevson, 11 winters, son of the cooper. And the apprentice held the oil pail through the storm and walked the chain with the Lampthane and the king on 2 dusks in 3 days. And the apprentice will hold the oil pail at every dusk hereafter until the Lampthane gives him the pole." The king said, "The master of the chain in this hold has been Master Eckard Lampthane for 9 winters by the polished dark bronze pin, and the master has not walked the chain in those 9 winters. And the master walked the chain at dusk yesterday, and the wick at the first lamp was below the half-finger height, and the flame would not have lasted the 3rd hour of the dark. And the parchment of the master's order has been torn by my hand at the foot of the first lamp, and the polished dark bronze pin has been laid on the long stone bench by the master's own hand at the 2nd hour of last night, and the bench has spoken the throat." The king said, "The throat is the Lampthane's." The keep yard did not move. The king said, "The road feast at the close of light, the chain at the close of light, the pin at the foot of the 47th by the grandmother's hand. The chain has held. The bench has held. The road watch has held. The king has been late. He stepped over the roadstone. He came across the gravel into the keep yard. He went to the long trestle table at the head, which was the head of the Lampthane and the bench and the road watch, not the head of the king. He sat at the Lampthane's right. Vigga sat at the Lampthane's left. Britta sat at Vigga's left. The boy sat at the king's right. The mother and the father and the child sat at Britta's left. The road feast began. The breadwomen set down the long loaves. The cold circuit men set down the stew. The cooper set down the small barrel of small beer. The keep yard ate. The keep had not eaten together at one trestle line in 11 winters. In the 3rd hour of the road feast, the close of light came up over the upper east pass. The gray rose came in. The gray rose purple came in. The cold settled. Solvi rose. The boy rose. They took the pole and the oil pail. They went west to the first lamp. She lit the first lamp the way she had lit the first lamp every dusk of the 12 winters. The boy held the oil pail at her right. The pale amber light came up clean and steady inside the heavy storm glass. She lit the 2nd and the 3rd and the 4th. The keep yard came out to the roadstone to watch. The king watched from the trestle. Vigga watched from the trestle. Britta watched from the trestle. She lit the chain east. 47 lamps, 80 paces apart, 4 miles, half-finger wick height. The boy kept the rhythm. He took 2 paces of rest at the 18th and 2 at the 33rd. He did not need to be told. At the 40th, she did not send the boy back. The road feast was the order. The boy stayed. They went on. They came to the foot of the upper east pass at the 47th. The king and Vigga and Britta and the mother and the father and the child had come up the road behind them. The keep yard had come up behind them. The cold circuit men, the smith, the cooper, the breadwomen, the kitchen runners, and the 2 men of the road watch were on the gravel. Vigga stood at the foot of the 47th post. Vigga had the polished, dark bronze pin on the folded square of pale linen in her right hand. Vigga's pale gray eyes were on Solvi. The boy held the oil pail. Solvi tipped the small brass measure into the 47th reservoir. She trimmed the wick at the half-finger height. She struck flint to steel. The wick took. The pale amber light came up clean and steady inside the heavy storm glass. The chain was complete. 47 lamps, 4 miles, 1 unbroken chain. She stepped back. She turned to Vigga. Vigga lifted the polished, dark bronze pin from the folded square of pale linen. Vigga's old thin hand was very steady. The pin caught the pale amber of the 47th. Vigga laid the polished, dark bronze pin at Solvi's throat. She set the small bronze pin back. Her hand stayed at Solvi's throat for 1 slow breath. Then she took the dark iron lamp flame pendant, the pin Solvi had worn since 12 winters, the pin her mother had given her, the pin Vigga had given Sigrun, and laid it on the folded square of pale linen in her own palm. Vigga said, "The throat is the Lampthane's, the Lampthane is the master." Solvi said, "The bench has spoken." Britta Roadwatch said, "The bench has spoken." The boy said, "The bench has spoken." The keepyard said, "The bench has spoken." The king said nothing. The king had walked up to the foot of the 47th with the keepyard. The king stood at Solvi's left, the place he had walked at her left shoulder for 2 dusks. The king lifted the dark iron lamp flame pendant from the folded square of pale linen in Vigga's palm. The king laid the dark iron pin on the small flat top of the iron post of the 47th lamp. The pin sat there in the pale amber light. The dark iron caught the flame and held it. The king said, "The line of 3, the line of 4, the pin of the Lampthane is at the post. The pin of the master is at the throat. The chain is the chain." He turned to Solvi. He did not bow. He did not speak. He took up his place at her left shoulder, the way he had walked the chain on the first dusk and the second dusk, the way she had led him. She did not step away from him. The keepyard came down off the foot of the upper east pass. They walked east along the chain under the pale amber lights, 4 miles down to the keep gate. Solvi walked at the head with the king at her left shoulder and the boy at her right. The polished, dark bronze pin was at her throat. The dark iron pin was at the post of the 47th, where her grandmother had given the pole to King Skarna 43 winters ago. At the 3rd milepost, the road watch hut window was open. Britta's 2 men were at the window. They gave the sign to the king. Palm out, fingers loose. The king gave it back. At the first lamp, Vigga sat down on the long stone bench at the lower keep gate. The cold circuit men set down the trestle tables a second time. The breadwomen set out the second round of long loaves. The road feast went on. Solvi did not sit at first. She stood at the foot of the first lamp with the king at her left shoulder. The pale amber light was on her face. The polished dark bronze pin at her throat caught the flame. She looked east up the chain, 47 pale amber lights running up 4 miles of the long road. Every wick at the half-finger height, the dark iron pin of the line of 3 burning at the post of the 47th. The king said, "Lampthane." She said, "Your grace." He said, "The chain has held." She said, "The chain has held." He said, "The king has come down." She said, "The king has come down." He said, "The king will come down again." She said, "The chain will be ready." He said, "Every dusk." She said, "Every dusk, your grace." She walked with him to the trestle. She sat down at the head of the long line, the king at her right, the boy at her left. Vigga at the king's right, and the keepyard ate the second round of long loaves, and the chain of 47 lights burned along the 4 miles. And the polished, dark bronze pin was at her throat, and the bench had spoken, and the chain had held, and the king had come down at last.